information about LGBTQ history of the Rochester area and how it tied into some bigger themes and everything.
Yeah.
And so we're very excited to have you back to share a new presentation with us, which I'm very excited to
It's
learn about.
Totally new,
So cool.
hot off the press. In fact, I finished it this afternoon.
Excellent.
But I've been thinking about it for a long while. In fact, I've been thinking about it since March, when Alex approached me through Facebook. He's like, "Hey, want to come talk again?" I said, "Yeah." And he's like, "What do you want to talk about?" I'm like, "How about this?" And so, yeah, I'm gonna talk about from Bayard to Bayard. I don't know if you've ever seen either of these two fellows, probably this fellow on the left a lot more than the fellow on the right. But you're gonna discover that these two folks have a connection. And we're gonna start with the guy on the right, who's the guy from the past. This is a guy named Bayard Taylor, and he was born in the 1820s. And right around the time he was born, a little bit after, in the 1830s, in New York City, this is old New York. Has anyone ever been to Stone Street in New York City? It's close to Wall Street. It looks like what New York looked like back in the day, in the first quarter decade, a little bit past the first quarter decade of the 19th century. And this is when New York started to become the powerhouse of American culture. And a lot of it was through the written word. And quite a bit of it was through a group of authors and writers who were writing in all different types of forms, poems, short stories, novels, plays, a bunch of folks called the Knickerbockers. Do you know what that word means? When we say knickers, what do we mean? Pants, yeah. And knickerbockers were actually kind of short pants. They were pants that went to right around the knee. And they were the pants that the Dutch settlers of New York in the 1600s wore. And so if you were somebody who wore those, and maybe in the early 1800s, you still had people wearing knickers and long hose and powdered wigs. They started calling them knickerbockers, knickers. Now, of course, it survived with this sports team, the New York Knicks. But it really came to fore with a magazine called the Knickerbocker, this New York monthly magazine. This one, I think, is from the 1850s, but it started in the 1830s. And there was this group of authors that were all sort of connected to this magazine. They were all friends. They all knew each other. And some of them are pretty famous. Washington Irving, William Cullen Bryant, and James Fenimore Cooper. And of the group, these are definitely the most famous and who still have power today. And of course, when we think about Washington Irving, we think of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This guy, not as much. He still had some staying power with his book, Thanatopsis. Yeah, I know. It really rolls off the tongue. And of course, James Fenimore Cooper with his Last of the Mohicans and that whole series, The Deer's Lair. These three folks that were part of this group were definitely the people that still have carried over almost 200 years to our time. But there were certainly other folks in this group. Have you ever heard of this guy? Robert Charles Sands. And this, I gotta tell you, for this talk, this is one of the only women in tonight's talk, unfortunately, just because of the way things are with these folks. But this was a woman named Lydia Maria Child, who, as the century moved on, became a suffragette. There was a guy named Nathaniel Parker Willis, who became an editor of magazines and newspapers. He was the guy who published Poe's poem, The Raven, later on. And this guy, with this wonderful Dutch last name and this wonderful Dutch first and middle name, Julian, spelled Gulian, Crommelin Verplank. And so these are all fairly obscure folks. Willis of this group is probably the most well-known. And have you ever heard of Nathaniel Parker Willis, N.P. Willis? No, of course not. And you've totally never heard of these two fellows. a guy named Fitz Green. Yes, Fitz Green Halleck and his friend, Joseph Rodman Drake. And this fellow, who grew into older age, is sort of credited for writing some of the first, what we would consider sort of gay content in America. And he and his friend Drake in the 18 teens especially started to collaborate on writing poems together. And they became the Croaker Poems. They sort of signed their pen name together. There was a lot of pen name stuff going on in this part of the 19th century. And you'll notice that Drake's image is actually more of an engraving. And that's because he died before photography was invented. He died in 1820. And when he died, his friend Halleck was actually bereft and wrote this poem on the death of Joseph Rodman Drake, his longest lasting literary work, as it says here in this book. And I'll just read you a few lines from this poem. When hearts whose truth was proven like lime are laid in earth, there should a wreath be woven to tell the world their worth. And I who woke each morrow to clasp thy hand in mine, who shared thy joy and sorrow, whose weal and woe were thine, it should be mine to braid it around thy faded brow. And he actually had this published.
Wow.
And it was like this very interesting, very strong male friendship couple very early in the 19th century. As I said, you can see this photograph of this fellow living much longer age. And when he passed away, there was actually a statue of him that was put up in a park. It was one of the first statues of an American author. Earlier, there had been a sort of a stone monument, and then later there was this statue. And when this statue was put up in 1869, President Rutherford B. Hayes came and spoke at the dedication of the statue. So here's someone you've never heard of, ever. I mean, I didn't even know who this guy was until just a couple of weeks ago. I was like, who's
What
this?
does he have in his hand?
He probably has like a sheath of paper,
Oh,
Yeah. And who else spoke at this particular dedication of this particular statue, this sort of first American author statue in New York City? Bayard Taylor. Bayard Taylor. When the memorial to Fitz Green Halleck was unveiled at Guilford, it was Bayard Taylor who delivered the address. The choice was not surprising. Taylor was considered at the time one of the greatest American poets, if not the greatest. But it's also possible that Taylor recognized other more personal affinities between himself and Halleck. The address itself gives no indication, but Taylor's tribute to Halleck does establish a connection, admittedly tenuous, between Halleck, the first poet of friendship in America, male friendship, and the flourishing of what could be almost called a school popping up later in the 1860s and 1870s. And so I want you to remember this little episode, this sort of male couple from the sort of more distant past of the 19th century, as we talk about this fellow, Bayard Taylor. This is one of his very first collections of poems. Bayard Taylor was born in Westchester, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. He came from Quaker stock, and he started his career as a writer and started writing poetry. And he was encouraged to do this by this guy, who has this incredibly amazing name of Edmund Fitzgibbon. And here he is in an engraving with his sheafs of paper and his books and things. He was encouraged to do this. And this collection of poetry, Zimina, or all these 19th century books said, or The Battle of the Sierra Morena, and other poems by James Bayard Taylor, published at Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. And this was his sort of first foray into the publishing world. And it did pretty well. He sort of had his friend who was this encourager, who was also an editor and author, who had been collecting books of poetry, and said, you should you should write a book of poems. We should have this printed. And that's amazingly cool. And Bayard actually became, kind of like this go-to kind of guy. In fact, he not only go-to'd, he went. Here's an article in a newspaper. This is from the Boston Traveler. And it says here, an enterprising youth, an apprentice to the printing business named J. Bayard Taylor from Westchester, PA, recently sailed from New York for Europe. Being somewhat of a poet, he called on Mr. Willis of the New Mirror before starting. And then it sort of talks about how great he is. He is in fine health, has a face full of sensibility and intelligence, yada, yada, yada. He's going to go to England. He's going to go to Germany, yada, yada, yada. Success to him. So why would a newspaper write about some guy who's just taking a trip? Well, it's because Bayard Taylor was savvy enough to go to all of these different magazines and newspapers and talk to their editors and say, if you advance me this money, I will write you an article. I will write you a short story. I will write you a blurb about my travel. And he did that with multiple newspapers who all printed this sort of same kind of thing. This oh, there's a fellow going to Europe, without really saying that he is in our employ. But with doing that. And so he was enterprising. He was it was like an author's advance, but he got a whole bunch of them. So he was able to sail over. Now, there were sailing ships going back and forth across the Atlantic every single day. And while this was certainly before the cable across to send telegraphic messages, there was mail coming back and forth like crazy. And the stories he was writing, the sort of travel log type things, they were not things that needed to have any kind of a deadline, They were all things that could be, printed next week kind of a thing. So America started to hear his name because he started to appear in all of these different newspapers across the country. And this is a much later edition of this book, but you can see Views Afoot. Also, or Europe seen with knapsack and staff. And this was a book that was published, sort of a collection of all these journalistic articles that he wrote, his travel logs. And he sort of became known as a travel writer. Today we don't really think of too many folks as travel writers. When the great author Bruce Chatwin died a few years ago, one of his books was about Patagonia, and he's somebody who's able to sort of evoke a place without us ever having to go there. We don't really see that so much. When we look at a travel website, we're looking to, maybe see where's the best restaurant, but it's all facts and figures. It's not so poetic. It's just saying, oh, they're open from on Fridays and Saturdays. Yeah.
And he was gay. He hid it mostly during his life.
He did.
Chatwin.
He did.
But he died of AIDS, and then people who knew him talked about the fact that he was gay.
Yep. And so we might even see some sort of parallels between him and our fellow here.
In the 90s.
Yeah. So here is Bayard in this wonderful portrait. It's a daguerreotype portrait. And here is a guy who hired him for his next adventure. This is a guy named Horace Greeley.
Oh,
Yeah. What do you know about, what do you know about Horace Greeley?
nothing.
Okay.
One of the muckrakers, right?
He was a muckraker.
Yeah.
He was a muckraker. In fact, he also ran for office. Later, in the 1850s. But he was quite the guy. He ran the New York Tribune, which became the New York Daily Tribune, and then back to the Tribune. And he actually hired Bayard Taylor to go somewhere not in Europe after he came back to the States. And where he hired him to go was to go to San Francisco. Now, San Francisco, at this very moment in 1849, was having its moment. Okay, see how many ships are in that harbor? This is a lithograph, but here's a daguerreotype of the same kind of scene. You can see there's 1 million ships in that harbor on the left-hand side there.
Do you know what they did with a lot of those ships?
What did they do with them?
They sunk them
Yeah.
down in the harbor area and put dirt and extended the land.
Oh, yeah, that
So
makes sense.
a lot of them went one way and stayed there.
Yeah, sure.
Which is
Well,
why earthquakes are so deadly there.
Well, it was a really long trip because of course, there was no Panama
No.
Canal. This was all the way around South America, around Tierra del Fuego, which has horrible, horrible weather because it's where the Arctic Ocean or the Antarctic Ocean, the Atlantic and the Pacific all meet. It's a very grueling trip to get there. And of course, what's amazing is that because of all this wealth, because of the incredible influx of population, even with all these challenges, is that you see just within the next year, California becoming a state, which is crazy. So this is all because of the gold rush. And here are a bunch of fellows on this postage stamp from 1999 when it was only 33 cents to send a letter. I don't even know what it is anymore because it just says forever.
68 or.
Whoa, okay.
You'll be paying off this debt
Okay,
forever.
yeah, it's crazy. But here are some daguerreotypes of some fellows, and these are really wonderful because this one especially is hand colored, going through. So these are all pictures taken 1849, 1850. Here we have a guy who his pan is still pretty shiny and his tools are not that dull. You know, a lot of times the 49ers would get their photographs taken in San Francisco before they went out into the field. And then I wanted to show this picture on the right because this is a fully staged daguerreotype, but it's actually the title, you know, which hardly any of these do. It's called News from California, which is kind of crazy. Here is a daguerreotype of Bayard Taylor taken in San Francisco. And a fellow I know, Nick Vaccaro, who's a photography collector and dealer, I know through Facebook. I actually own some photos that I bought from Nick. He owns this photograph of Bayard Taylor. And he bought it from another guy named Jules, and Jules had posted it like maybe 4 or 5 years ago and said that he knows of only 2 photographs of Bayard Taylor that were taken in daguerreotype.
Wow.
This one that Jules at that time owned, and one that was in a book called The American Daguerreotype. And I went home and I went, I have that book. And so here you can see another daguerreotype of Bayard. This is from 1851, but this one is definitely from 1849. So that's kind of a cool thing. I'm like, oh wait, I have that book on my shelf because I'm me, you know, which is kind of weird, but that's okay. I'm Gerry, you know. So all of this turned out to be a bunch of news articles sent to Horace Greeley and a book. And this is a much later edition, but called El Dorado, which of course we know is Spanish for, you know, the Golden Place by Bayard Taylor. A sophisticated newspaperman's report of the raw violence and excitement of California in 1849. And as you can see, it actually has that lithograph on the cover of this, which is kind of a cool thing. All right, so here we are, 1849. Here comes 1850, mid-century, and enter this guy. Who's that?
Zachary Taylor?
Nope.
P.T. Barnum.
Yes, it is P.T. Barnum. P.T. Barnum, one of the most famous people in America mid-century. And it was because of his circus, but also because of this museum that you see here. So this is a picture from around 1850. You see an omnibus over here. You see all these flags. You see Barnum's Museum. 500,000 curiosities. He put that sign on there because he said, if anybody can tell me that I don't have that many, and of course, we can't comprehend that much. Here's another image of it right there, which is absolutely crazy.
Where is it in San Francisco?
No, this is in New York. So Barnum was known for this museum having both objects as well as human specimens. So here we have Captain Castentus, the Greek Albanian, and he is all covered with tattoos everywhere. He's got this fine beard. And then here's this lady with this fine beard. So bearded ladies, of course, Chang and Eng, the original Siamese twins, who are actually from what we now call Thailand. You know, he was kind of this huckster sort of, you know, using both objects and people for, you know, monetary gain. Not necessarily sort of in a more surreptitious way, as you know, over the board, I guess you could say. Sometimes he was sort of faking it. You know, for instance, he found some little people. And so we have General Tom Thumb, and then this lady here, Lavinia Warren, who became Mrs. General Tom Thumb. Apparently they had a very happy marriage, but it was all sort of staged. It was all the prefab four, if you will. He really had this idea of being able to sort of manipulate all sorts of folks, and people paid good money for it. Of course, we had the elephants. Jumbo was the most famous. The Fiji mermaid, which in this advertisement, this reminds me of those ads that we saw for the sea monkeys, which were, they were wearing crowns, but it was actually like a dried monkey connected to like a fish, a dried fish. I mean, it was just awful. So even though he was extremely wealthy, fabulously wealthy, one of the wealthiest people in all of America, he also suffered from this idea that people thought that he was kind of a jerk, kind of a huckster. Who could be like this today? But he was definitely delivering a product. But he saw that what needed to happen next after making all this money is that his reputation needed to be fixed up. And so he hatched a plan that sounds crazier than anything, convincing the most famous soprano in Europe to come over to America and to give a tour. And so here she is, Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale. At the time, she was living in England. She was singing at Covent Garden. She was performing for Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. She was singing all the bel canto operas by Donizetti, Bellini, Meyerbeer. And he convinced her to pay her to come over and tour the United States. And not only did he promote her musically, but he promoted her morally, that she was a chaste, pure, good Christian woman. Because at the time, going to the theater, going to even classical music concerts, women were considered practically prostitutes on the stage. And here we had this beautiful, young, single woman who was singing literally in front of the crowned heads of Europe. And he was able to convince her. So here she is in New York City, getting her photo taken by Roots. Here she is, getting her photo taken by Matthew Brady, And the concert was scheduled to take place at this place called the Castle Garden. The Castle Garden is in Battery Park. It's still there. At least parts of it is where you buy your ticket to go see the Statue of Liberty. So you can take a boat from it, right there. So it's this building here. It's this weird round building. And if you look at it, it actually has a sign that talks about all the different things that happened there, including Jenny Lind's performance. So leading up to this, Barnum decided to do something kind of amazing. People love a competition. We love baking competitions. Pillsbury is their baking competition. We love watching the Great British Bake Off. We love watching America's Got Talent. He decided to have a competition for people to write a poem to welcome Jenny Lind. A welcome ode, if you will. And he put it in the newspapers all across the country, and people started writing like crazy and sending in, self-addressed stamped envelope kind of thing, so that it could be performed at her very first concert. And here is a Currier Knives lithograph of Jenny Lind's first appearance of Jenny Lind in America at Castle Garden, September 11th. Yes, that date, 1850. Here is another more like a woodcut view of the interior Castle Garden. Here you can see a piano. Here you can see like a full orchestra. Yeah, it was quite the thing. It was quite the thing. All right, so enter my friend Ray. You see here, I took that photograph of him. He is the person who actually has the very first piece ever performed at Jenny Lind's first concert ever. It was set to music by this guy right here, a guy named Julius Benedict, who was the kind of the musical director for the first part of the tour. He was a German-English composer. His most famous piece is an opera called The Brides of Venice, which no one knows today. And here it is. This is it. This is it in Julius Benedict's hand. Greeting to America. What does it say there at the very top?
Words by
Bayard Taylor.
Bayard Taylor
Wow.
won the competition.
Wow.
Which is
Forgot.
crazy, crazy cool. Music by Julie Spendick, composed for commission P.T. Barnum. Jenny Lind, first concert in America, Castle Garden, and all those things that you know. And here it is in Julie Spendick's hand. It's at Stanford University. They've only had it for about 5 years now. And if you see here, it says, "I greet with a full heart the land of the West," which are the very first lines that Bayard Taylor wrote. Yeah, and so we're actually gonna listen to this. This lady here, Elizabeth Parcells, she actually recorded an album of Jenny Lind songs. And so we're gonna listen to this tune so you can hear Bayard Taylor's words set to Julius Benedict's music. Okay, hopefully this will work.
Yeah, hope, here's hoping.
Okay. Okay, let me go to the desktop, which is
Buried under several layers now.
right there.
Uh-oh.
It's coming through. Oh, there it is.
This is before the Civil War, 10 years. So he's thinking perhaps of the Revolutionary War soldiers. Now, of course, this would have been performed with the orchestra, but versions were made for piano. There was a lot of this sort of talk about Jenny Lind being far away from home, far away from her native Sweden, far away from England. Well, it's very sweet. It really is. And, you
We're
know,
just not used to that kind of stuff.
well, I am a little, because I work in East End. It's like a parlor song from 1850. You know, it's like a Stephen Foster song almost. You know, what I wanted to draw attention to is, you know, California, California, California. And Oaks to the Sunset, it's Gateway of Gold, the Golden Gate. Of course, before the bridge was there, there's this very narrow passage. That's the Golden Gate to lead into San Francisco Bay. Everyone was thinking about it in 1850. Everyone, because everyone was thinking about what was happening in California the year before too. But when Jenny Lind sang this on September 11th, California had become a state on September 8th.
Wow.
So, you know, even though Bayard Taylor wrote this a little bit before, yeah.
Go back to sharing your screen.
Okay, sure.
Oh, there's the instructions.
Thank you. I'll have some more coffee while Alex,
Yes.
Alex figures it out.
Well, now is he still, co-hosting? Cause I don't see the. Okay, there we go. And wants this one,
That
this
one.
one.
You know, we struck that back then they didn't have all of the ways of
Did I do it?
communicating that we do
Okay.
now. So everything was written or painted or maybe photographed. You didn't see
Yeah.
it on TV or in
Yep.
movies or anything.
There was no radio, there was nothing.
No.
Open up then.
Oh, yeah, they're seeing it, but not this part.
Is that changing it to what they're seeing?
Nope, you're still seeing.
Okay, great.
And so, yeah, you should just be able to go through the. Minimize that, yeah. And it's just, it's out of that. Yes.
Thank you, thank you.
I don't understand these things either.
I think I found it.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah,
anywho.
we can.
So, everyone that was not at the concert proper wanted to know about this song because it had been touted for months and months and months. And, you know, he was announced as the winner. And so they printed this like single broadsheet. And what I love about this is by Bayard Taylor Esquire, sung by Manuel Jenny Lind, maybe sung to the tune of the Star Spangled Banner.
Okay.
Because of course, you know, no one knew that song. It was totally new. That was a world premiere. The only people that heard it were the people at that concert, and that was probably it, you know? So I don't know if I agreed with a full heart, the land of the West. It doesn't really fit very well, but you get, yeah. So for 1 cent, you could buy this and have a copy of this. So, very quickly, they did create sheet music, and I actually have in my collection a piece of sheet music from this. It's pretty spectacular. This is actually one where they just cut the cover off. I also have a complete one. There it is, but yeah, there it is. There it is. Jenny Lind. And look at how spectacular this is.
Yeah.
Here she is on the stage with her handkerchief, and she's sort of holding her hand out like this, and her hair is, you know, all up with the flowers in her hair. But you have all these like gods and goddesses around it, around her. It's really quite stunning. Quite stunning. And then here's one that isn't maybe as spectacular, but still is fine. And this actually has all of the words. So this is from
Wow.
1850. Bayard Taylor Esquire, Julius Benedict. Yeah. All right, so many people sent in poems and weren't chosen because only one person was. It was like, you know, a lottery kind of. That they actually created a book.
Oh, wow.
It's called Barnum's Parnassus. It was kind of like a satire. Confidential disclosures of the prize committee on the Jenny Lind song. And it was published in 1850. And look at this here. This is one that didn't make it. And thou, sweet Jenny, 10th muse, for so my fond heart shrines you. With what resplendent golden hues my glowing thoughts entwines you. Oh, wert thou but my guiding star, I'd fly where once I plodded. Thou charming California, in human form embodied. So there. This is actually the 3rd edition, it says, which is crazy. Like, how could this go through 3 editions? And it seems like this particular edition actually was after the tour started, because there's this poem. Sing, Jenny Lind, for Barnum hears and listens to, while both his ears drink in the vocal honey. Sing for the credit of your name. Sing for your transatlantic fame. And Barnum's ready money. Oh, poor guy. Well, this really brought Bayard's name to everyone's attention, more so than his travel articles, because everyone was focused on her arrival. Thousands of people were there when she arrived in New York City, and of course her tour took over 2 years across the country. Newspapers were telling you what she was doing every single day, where she was. It's kind of crazy. You know, the only person I can compare her to today that is like that is Taylor Swift, where we know everything she is doing every single day. Even Beyonce, we don't know what she's doing. We don't know what.
No.
We never knew what Barbra Streisand was doing. I mean, she sang to us, but we didn't follow every motion. And what is happening with Taylor Swift is exactly what's happened to Jenny Lind in 1850, 51, 52. So here we have Horace Greeley. He's like, hey, Bayard, that was great that you wrote that. You won that prize. You did a great job in California. You did a great job, in Europe. I'm going to hire you. So this is the Tribune building that you see there. And this is from 1851. This is actually a year after she came by. This is what it looked like, the New York Daily Tribune. Not really hardly any pictures, engravings or woodcuts. But yeah, here's the staff of the New York Daily Tribune. Yeah, quite a group of this large daguerreotype. And here is our hero, Bayard Taylor, sitting there in the front row, the second guy. And here is Horace Greeley, the editor, sitting right next
It's
to
like
him.
he has one piece of hair coming down in the middle.
Yes, it might be a scratch, but yes, that seems about right. Yeah, and then,
Horace Greeley was bigger.
yeah, no, just in terms of his cultural significance, but yeah. And then I wanted to show you this guy. His name is William Henry Fry, and he's most famous as the music critic. He also spent time in Europe and also sent dispatches back across the Atlantic. So he kind of followed this Bayard Taylor model. But he is the composer of the Santa Claus Symphony, which is, yeah, hark to the story of Santa and his awful symphony. This is from 1970 from the New York Times Critic. It is so bad. Yeah, this is a really, really funny article too. Fry had no illusions about his symphony. He knew it was a masterpiece. An extravaganza indeed. I claim that for Santa Claus, it is the longest unique symphony ever written. It's really pretty great. And yes, there is a recording of it up there. You can find it on YouTube. I'm not gonna play this for you, but I just thought it was funny that in the same photograph of Bayard Taylor and Horace Greeley is also this curious mid-century person, William Henry Fry. Yeah, he also has a Niagara overture, which has 8 timpani. Wow. Making it sound like the waterfall. Yes, it's crazy.
That's cool.
Yeah, so as Bayard is sort of moving through history and is getting older, you start to see that he's still writing poetry. And of course, here is his friend, Mr. Griswold, who has been editing this book. This is the 17th edition. So every year, huge collection of poems by people you've never heard of. Okay, and what I loved about this is from 1856, 2 years later, is that when this was reproduced by or scanned by the Library of Congress, it gave it this sort of rainbow effect. And no matter how large or small I made it, it was still there. And I went, okay, most of the authors had their signature. So if you want to forge, go nuts. They also have a biography of each of the poets. And if you look here at the list of the start of the list of poems, there's a couple on the next page. There's a bunch of these poems, and almost all of these have a foreign thing going on. Something going on in Italy, Nubia, extract from a poem to R.H. Stoddard. We'll hear about him in a minute. The Bison track. So out west, the Bedouin song, the Arab in the Palm, Charmaine. I don't know if it's the same as the Charmaine tune from the 1920s and 30s. The Poet of the East, Kilimanjaro, Oriental Idol. These are all these sort of exotic kind of poems that he was writing based on his travel. And in fact, he was actually painted in Bedouin costume, which is kind of crazy, kind of wild. Yeah. And this brings us to another person from the mid-century that you all know, Stephen Foster, because Bayard Taylor's name kept coming up in Stephen Foster books. And I was like, what is going on? And it's because Bayard Taylor wrote about the song, Oh, Susanna. Bayard Taylor, a world traveler, reporter, and poet taster, heard it sung in Hindu in Delhi and whistled by a yellow-headed Somersetshire lout under the broken noses of the battered saints in the unique antique archway of a Roman church. Taylor himself entertained Arabs among the ruins of Baalbek in what is now Lebanon by playing Uncle Ned by Foster on his flute. And so there's this crazy painting. And it's just, I'm like, wow, how weird. There's this strange connection between our guy and Stephen Foster, okay? These are pieces that are actually at the Sibley Music Library. These have been digitized. And you can't see with this one because it's all these things by George W. Chadwick, Boston composer from the late 19th century. But the Bedouin Love Song is here. That poem is set by him. We have the Persian Serenade, verse by Bayard Taylor, music by Harriet Ware, whoever she was. And then later, as we move into the century, Bayard Taylor became very famous for writing the words to the National Ode, based on the centennial of America in 1876. But before that, he started corresponding with this guy, Walt Whitman. Of course, Walt is the author of Leaves of Grass. 1855 is when the first edition came out. Here's a wonderful copy. These sell, of course, for thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars out there on the market, which is kind of crazy. And pulling out. Yeah. Yeah. Young Bayard Taylor, this is from a book called Walt Whitman, A Gay Life. For example, wrote to Walt in 1866 to praise Leaves of Grass for two things he could find nowhere else in the literature of the day: awe for human life as expressed in the human body. And of course, Walt's poetry is very visceral, if you will. And that tender and noble love of man for man, which once certainly existed, but now seems to have gone out of the experience of the race. You know, he sort of saw in Walt Whitman's poetry, especially in 1856 with the Calamus poems, that there was something else. There was a little bit of this male-male bonding, you know, that was appearing. And as such, we know that Bayard Taylor, while he, you know, was inspired or sort of saw those Knickerbocker folks at the beginning of the century as this group, you know, by the mid-century, there were all these folks that were called the Bohemians. You know, we kind of think of Bohemian folks as like the Beat Generation, Jack Kerouac, you know, William Burroughs, those folks. But in the 1850s, there were the New York Bohemians, and they hung out at this place called Pfaff's. And here's a picture of Walt. It was a Resco, like beer and wine cellar in the Coleman House Hotel, favorite haunt of the Bohemians of the 1850s, including poet Walt Whitman. And there is actually a website called The Vault at Pfaff's. Say that 10 times fast. And Bayard Taylor makes an appearance there. And he's sort of adjacent, if you will. You know, he sort of would go there sometimes, you know, hang out with the folks. You know, it says, you know, he wasn't a frequent, you know, but he's on there. And I was like, oh, is he a Bohemian? Well, what I'm finding is that he's sort of more classified as a genteel poet. And these are poets that were really very active in the 1860s and 70s, including our man Taylor, some guy named Stedman, George Boker, Mr. Stoddard, of which you saw a poem that was dedicated to him in that list of poetry. I went to a used bookstore and I said, do you have any Bayard Taylor? And the guy's like, who's that? And I was like, well, let me poke around. So I found this. It's called the Sunny Side Book. And there was a magazine that was published for like just a couple of years. And it's beautiful publisher's binding. And has this list of authors there. This was published in 18 something. I know this is kind of blurry. It actually has a few people that are like Bryant, who is a Knickerbocker type, but Bayard Taylor. It's interesting that they have Stedman and Bayard Taylor. They have his full name as opposed to just the other people have their last name. Maybe there were other Taylors. Maybe it was Zachary Taylor. You know, they were trying to just, but Howells, Stoddard, those are people whose pictures I just showed you. They are all people in this book. And I put this together knowing the genteel poets. And then I went back to try to find these pictures that I took back in March of this Bayard Taylor book. And I went, okay, here they are. Yeah. And so here's this poem by Bayard Taylor called Napoleon at Gotha. I'm sure it's terrible. But, you know, there you go. And I love how every single page has this blue border. This is a really nice book. So these poets were all sort of part of this romantic friendship, the romantic friendship of men together. And sometimes Bayard actually got a little bit more Whitman-y, if you will. This is from the Poetical Works of Bayard Taylor, the Household Edition. Yes, that's how famous he was. There was a household edition of his poetry. This is a poem called On the Headland, near the ocean there. And he says, I pine for something human, man, woman, young or old, something to meet and welcome, something to clasp and hold. I have a mouth for kisses, but there's no one to give and take. I have a heart in my bosom, beating for nobody's sake. I could take the sunburnt sailor like a brother to my heart. Oh, sorry, to my breast. That's even more. I could clasp the hand of any outcast of land or sea if the guilty palm but answered the tenderness in me. Here is a photograph that's from my collection of this pretty spectacular image of a sailor. Yeah. So a year after Bayard Taylor was memorializing this fellow from the Knickerbocker generation who had written this poem for his dead friend and who was known as being so close to his friend. Bayard Taylor wrote what we sort of consider now his magnum opus. This book, Joseph and His Friend, A Story of Pennsylvania. It came out in 1870. So he was inspired by this relationship to write this book about these two men having this closeness that no one had ever really explicitly written about in a novel before. It's very much like what E.M. Forster did with the relationship between Edward Carpenter and George Merrill. And he wrote a book inspired by these two lovers who were living in this cottage. He was inspired to write Morris. Now, he left explicit instructions that it not be published until after his death, because he felt that at the time, people would not accept it. And also at the time, in England especially, where this is set and where he was writing, homosexuality was still a crime. If it was overt like that. And so this came out in 1970. And then, of course, it was made into a film by Merchant Ivory. And then these are different editions that kind of show this book. And this book, man, I wanted to give you a bit of a review. This is actually a book about Bayard Taylor, a biography of him. There are a bunch of them in the late 19th century. And Joseph and His Friend only gets this blurb right here. The fourth and last of Bayard Taylor's novels, Joseph and His Friend, A Story of Pennsylvania, was begun in January 1869 at Cedar Croft, contributed serially in the Atlantic, believe it or not, and published by Putnam, November 24th, 1870. It is an unpleasant story of mean duplicity and painful mistakes. The characters are shallow and their surroundings shabby. There is not a single pleasing situation or incident in the book. Bismarck told Taylor that he had read the novel twice and was sure it contained one serious defect. He said, "You let your villain escape too easily, and that is not poetic justice, nor any kind of justice, in my opinion." Yes, out of ambition. But what you see is you start to see the fact that this book, especially, is the book that has made such a mark in terms of gay people in the 19th century. This is a book called Strangers, Homosexual Love in the 19th Century. And it says here, allegory is still a contentious aspect of gay writing and, sort of hiding things a little bit. But Bayard Taylor's Joseph and His Friend, 1870, described a new world beyond the Rocky Mountains where men might love each other without fear of conventional society. It was dedicated to those who believe in the truth and tenderness of man's love for man, as of man's love for women. This phrase was omitted from the British edition, which I think is very, very interesting. Yeah.
When was that written?
1870.
Wow.
1870. And here I wanted to read a little bit more from it. They took each other's hands. The day was fading, but only the twitter of nesting birds was heard in the boughs above them. Each gave way to the impulse of his manly love, rarer, alas, but as tender and true as the love of a woman, and they drew nearer and kissed each other. As they walked back and parted on the highway, each felt that life was not wholly unkind, and that happiness was not yet impossible.
That's lovely.
Okay, and then here it talks about the pastoral dream leads finally not to California. California again. We will only go there on one of those idle Epicurean journeys of which we dream, not to seek a refuge from the perversions of the world. For I have learned another thing, Philip. The freedom we crave is not a thing to be found in this or that place unless we bring it with us. We shall not find it. This is from a book that is about homosexual poetry, and it talks about the genteel or academic tradition. It's interesting, the whole chapter is called the academic tradition, but throughout it's just described as the genteel tradition, the genteel, movement. Bayard Taylor enjoyed an immense advantage over Fitz Green Halleck, the statue. By the 1850s and 60s, a considerable literary community had developed in New York and Boston, providing friendship and support. These writers spoke for genteel values and would be firmly opposed by folks like Twain. But they provided the second important literary community in the United States, the first being the Transcendentalists. I think that's wrong. I think it was the Knickerbockers. And so the genteel writers shared a regard for friendship, and they practiced in their lives and celebrated in their art. Around Bayard Taylor there were several writers clearly on close personal terms whose work displays a sharing of literary ideas and a frequent interchanges of support and homage. He appears to have been at the center of a homosexual literary circle which flourished for a period of about 20 years. None of them was as nearly as frank or as concerned with homosexual definition as Taylor. And when you look in these different anthologies, and some of these are huge, I mean, just incredibly chunky. Here is this one. Gigantic, this one here on the left. You find some of Bayard Taylor's poems. When you look at this book, which is called Pages Passed from Hand to Hand, the Hidden Tradition of Homosexual Literature in England from 1748 to 1914, there is an excerpt from Joseph and his friend in this, as well as a little bit of a biographical sketch of Bayard Taylor. There's also stuff in the Gay Museum Literary Heritage. These are huge, volumes. And where you don't see his writing, and where you don't see his poetry, and where you don't see any of the poems of that genteel tradition is in the anthologies that you would find for college. I was at my parents' house this last week, and my parents had all these anthologies of literature, and some of them were printed in the 1960s, and they went all the way back to colonial times and before that, William Bradford and Cotton Mather and all that. And none of them had Bayard Taylor. None of them had Stoddard. None of them had any of these other folks. They had Walt Whitman, but these are all sort of considered like minor figures. But for gay folks, they have rediscovered Joseph and his friend. They have rediscovered some of his poetry, like the poetry of the sailor. These are things that I'm reading from facsimiles of his poetry, but these are things that are quoted in all of these literary criticism books. People are paying attention to him. Now, he lived a really interesting life as time went on. He built this fabulous house called Cedarcroft in Kennett Square in Pennsylvania. It's still a private home, but it's really quite amazing. This is something from my own collection. I actually have his autograph with Cedarcroft underneath it, which is pretty cool. I also have this engraving of him, which is pretty cool. I actually found a children's book online that was published at the end of the 19th century that was about American authors, and he was one of them. And I was like,
Wow.
you were teaching children about Bayard Taylor. Here he is, a much older fellow. Towards the end of his life, he became a diplomat. He was like an ambassador to Germany and actually died in Europe and came back across the States. His body was borne across on a sailing ship. He had a fabulous funeral. Look at his fabulous stone, which has this copper image of his face on it, which is kind of amazing.
So did he remain single?
He did not. He actually did marry. And he had a daughter. But he had this, almost this other life that was sort of hidden. But if you read this stuff and you see it and here he is corresponding with Walt Whitman, when you're writing Walt Whitman, you might be gay. Just saying, I mean, Edward Carpenter wrote the Walt Whitman, You have that connection between these guys in the 1820s being written about in the 1870s. And the guy who did the writing was a guy who wrote Walt Whitman. And then you have Edward Carpenter, who wrote Walt Whitman, and he's being written about by E.M. Forster, being made into a movie, which you can watch on, Hulu or Netflix, It's this incredible chain of these literary people all throughout the century. That's kind of amazing. I was really happy to see that there's actually a new 21st century biography of Bayard Taylor, the Sherman Dreamer of America's Rise, 1825 to 1878. And I love how they have that picture with a hookah. We can see that now. The detail, we couldn't see that before, And of course, his home is still there, which is amazing. Pretty fabulous. I discovered that the Kennett Library used to be the Bayard Taylor Library. And in many ways, what I discovered is that now, I'm glad that there's that biography. That's really new. It's from only 2014, which is where a biography is brand new. But he's sort of like celebrated locally, like in, Kennett Square, like everybody knows who that is. But, had any of you ever heard of him? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about this guy. So born quite a bit later, 1912, Westchester, Pennsylvania. Interesting. Here is a early mugshot of him. Yeah. After finishing high school, he had some odd jobs. He traveled widely. Obtained 5 years of university schooling at the City College of New York without actually taking a degree, but became very passionate for civil rights, against racial segregation, and became someone who would do something like this, a sit-in, with other supporters, including white folks, speaking on behalf of, at the time, what everyone called themselves the Negro cause, if you will. He worked for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a non-denominational religious organization from 1941 to 1953. And he organized the New York branch of another reformist group, the Congress on Racial Equity, in 1941. Now, that 1953 date is very interesting. Here is Jet magazine from 1954. Here's Diane Carroll, who just died last year. Of course, she was Julia on TV in the 1960s. And then you may know her from Dynasty, where she was John Collins' nemesis. Yeah, but she was known at the time as a singer. Are homosexuals becoming respectable? And this is this article. And I just, this is a digest magazine. If you've ever seen Jet, it's like about this big. And so there's not a lot on each page, but what I love is the graphic design of this from the mid-50s, this sort of mid-century modern. And here we have one of the best kept secrets on the campus of Southern Negro College is a noted genius was overly fond of young boys. So some of it has to do with, not such great, unsavory stuff. This is interesting. Here's a fellow, Charles Brown, an outspoken sex deviant, made no secret of desire to have a sex-changing operation, marrying a GI. So, the language being used by this magazine is not so great, sort of talking about folks who are either out about what they want or people who were arrested. And here's an interesting thing. Globe girdling lecturer, that's Nehru on the left from India. Bayard Rustin was jailed on sex counts. Yes, he was arrested. In 1953, Rustin, who was homosexual, was arrested in California. He was discovered having sex with a man. He served 50 days in jail and was registered as a sex offender. While his sexual orientation resulted in him taking a less public role, he was highly influential within the civil rights movement. And of course, that was when he started to meet and work with Martin Luther King Jr. And so here's Bayard on the left, non-identified fellow in the middle, and Dr. King. And what they worked on was the March on Washington. The March on Washington. The 1963 March on Washington. Yeah. He was the principal organizer of King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the chief architect of the March on Washington in August 1963, so 10 years after his arrest.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. This is that other shot was a sort of a detail of this larger picture that you see here. Yeah. And the thing is that here's from Jet a little later. Loyal aide Philip Randolph has stood firm against those who criticized Rustin's arrest and imprisonment records, always refusing to fire him. He knows he can depend on Bayard Rustin. Oblivious to attacks, Rustin shaped masterful march. Yeah, and after the march, he just kept going. All these causes, it was just kind of astounding. Yeah. He directed a one-day student boycott of New York City's public schools to protest against racial imbalances. And he served as the president of the A. Philip Randolph Institute, a civil rights organization in New York City from 1966 to 1979. Yeah, Poor People's March Confidential. Yeah, so it might be Rustin who can weld the coalition of his labor backers in the AFL-CIO and the ghetto following the support of Reverend Abernathy's goals. So he kept going after King was assassinated. He kept going. And yeah, and what I love is how you start to see today, because he's such a recent figure, all of these amazing pieces of art. And that could be your t-shirt. That could be Rustin. Yeah, celebrate queer Quakers, the Black Quaker Project. Because yeah, he was also a Quaker. I love this. I love that wild blue. It's amazing to me that this photograph, which is such a significant, iconic image of him in Harlem, and with the March on Washington poster behind his head, has become this basis for all these different pieces of art. It's really, really amazing. And how both African American communities are celebrating him and queer communities are celebrating him, because he never, ever, ever went back in the closet. He never, ever, ever. And that's why he was always sort of in the background. He was always in the background. And I just think it's great that he's, getting this due right now. These are all contemporary images that I'm just grabbing off of websites that have articles about him. There are books about him, a collection of essays edited by this person, A Legacy of Protests and Politics. This Michael Long guy also wrote this book, which I think is a children's book about him. Unstoppable, how Bayard Rustin organized the 1963 March on Washington. There's a Bayard Rustin Legacy Forum. There are things named after him, keeping his memory going, perpetuating his memory. It's amazing that he just never went back in. And I love this photograph. I love that mid-century, those curtains. Those curtains gotta go, all right? Sorry, those are well. They're fabulous. Now, 10 years ago, people wouldn't have liked those, but now everyone's like, where can I put those with my Wayfarer furniture? I love this beautiful illustration of him, because it has this, wonderful quote, and it has this beautiful negative space. Isn't it great? So yeah, so this is from Jet when he passed away. He died in 1987, 77 years old. Long record of civil rights arrests, Quaker pacifist, and joined the War Resisters League, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. When King was slain in Memphis, Rustin took on the painful task of organizing a massive mourning march. And then here is, maybe a few months later, about his funeral. And all these different folks came. There's a photograph of him, there's his aunt, all these folks down here. A lot of folks I don't know, I don't follow the labor movement from the late 60s, early 70s into the 80s. But one of the very interesting things it says here is, the son Rustin adopted in 1982, Walter Nagel, 1938, along with his friends and dignitaries from across the country, gathered to pay their final respects to the memory of the civil rights and labor leader. Walter Nagel was not Bayard Rustin's son. He was his lover. And the only way in 1987 that his lover could have inherited his whatever, had any kind of rights to his remains, to his funeral, to whatever money, was to adopt that person, which is astonishing now that we think about it. Now, Bayard Rustin was actually celebrated 20 years ago with this documentary called Brother Outsider, The Life of Bayard Rustin. Now, this is before people were like watching lots of documentaries. It was way before, well, not way before, but a little bit before Super Size Me from the late Morgan Spurlock, which sort of led to this documentary craze. And now it's, there's just so many documentaries about everything, which is great. I think they're wonderful. There's even a documentary film festival in Rochester. But this is a movie that got sort of shown on the gay circuit through gay film festivals. It also got shown on PBS. And it's a really important film. It also got shown today. This poster is today. So at 2 p.m. in room 1161, the Kierhoff Center, there were people watching this movie, which is kind of amazingly cool.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I thought we could watch the trailer for the documentary, which I have here. All right, if you can get it to that page, that would be great. It's just a couple minutes long, but I thought you could see what, yeah, that one right there, yeah.
I am not ready to die. I want no Negro to die. I want no human being to die or to be brutalized. Because I thoroughly believe that this struggle can be won without brutalization. We will not tolerate the beating heart of black people any longer. We will stay in these damn streets until every Negro in the country can vote. We call for a non-violent uprising with people sitting, standing, being arrested, white and black together.
Bayard liked to cause trouble. He caused trouble in very banal and everyday ways. He caused trouble in world historical ways.
We have been told that we will be arrested if we stay here.
Bayard's life was over some 60 years of activism. And almost every major event between the 40s through the 70s, Bayard played a role.
Sit down, I can't sit down. Now won't you sit down, I can't sit down. Just don't everyone move around.
I don't think without Bayard Rustin, the modern civil rights movement would have won half of the victories that it won.
That same contingency ended in every school district in the year 1963.
It is hard for me to think of a man who was more talented, a public intellectual, and organizer unequaled in his time. Why did he remain in the background? Why was he an advisor to this, that, or the other great person? But never himself coming forward in the full measure of his great talent.
course, when this came out, that was the teaser to get you to come to see this.
We need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers. Our power is in our ability to make things unworkable. The only weapon we have is our bodies. And we need to tuck them in places so wheels don't turn.
Hmm. Yeah, very cool. All right, if you can,
You might have gotten it. Oh,
that,
what's it doing? No, okay.
okay,
Sorry. One good time.
yeah. I believe you can watch this entire documentary on YouTube. You can also watch it on Canopy if you subscribe to that, if you're through an academic institution, which is great. Okay. Terrific. So I just, now what I need is to be
Oh,
able
yeah,
to see.
the,
No, I think I need to
Oh.
actually.
oh,
Do this.
gotcha.
Good, yeah. Bayard, Rustin was also featured on this recent series on PBS, hosted by Henry Louis Gates, the guy who does Find Your Roots, called The African Americans. He was one of the folks who really got quite a bit of feature. I found out that there was a play about him that was done just in 2022. Troublemaker, organizer, Quaker, queer. And these are some stills that are taken from this theatrical production, which I thought were pretty amazing. And there's a rock band that plays behind. And this play did not shy away from him being an openly gay man and in a relationship with a white man too. So, yeah. And of course, that leads us to this year's movie, Rustin, which was produced by Netflix, but was actually part of the ability to be able to be part of the Academy Awards. It was actually released in theaters. And it stars Coleman Domingo here on the left-hand side as Bayard Rustin. And here are a couple of shots from this film. Yeah. All right, I didn't want to show the trailer for this too. It was also pretty short, but I wanted you to see what this movie looked like. And so I do have that called up as well, over here on the, and that's the last multimedia thing that I have. I swear, no, it's not. It's like this, it's the penultimate one, but here's the trailer. So if you can get this to work, it's only a couple minutes long. It's only 2 minutes long, but I thought I wanted you to see it, because has anyone seen that movie yet? Has anyone seen it? Okay, great. So I wanted you to see what it looked like. Okay.
So an epic demonstration in our nation's capital, organized in 8 weeks. Do this, Dr. King. Own your power.
There's one person who organized and invented this scam.
Now with Bayard Rustin, attention grabbing edges, make him an easy target. I mentioned the unmentionable. Our new officers, administration made up of angelic troublemakers such as yourselves. On August 28th, black, white, young, old, rich, working class, poor, will descend on Washington, D.C.
Just like that photo.
This new generation is restless and angry. But as it's opposed to using violence, but must be prepared to receive it. You're relevant. It's Friday night. Having complex. Your mere presence would derail the fight for racial justice in this country a good 10, 15 years. On the day that I was born black, I was also born a homosexual.
We're calling for a peaceful march on Washington.
Committed to the cause, altering the trajectory of this country towards freedom. I know and justice. What do you do now?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, I thought you should see that.
Yeah. So that's on Netflix now.
It is on Netflix now.
Oh, did your thing close? I don't see your presentation anymore. Well, you have to reopen it.
Okay,
Or is it hidden somewhere?
can be hidden.
Oh, it is hidden somewhere.
It is
Okay,
hidden
amazing.
somewhere.
Should be able to, yeah.
We good? Okay. One of
Oh,
those.
no, not that one. Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
Yes? Okay, great. So.
Well, almost know how to do that.
So one of the other things that was amazing about this movie is the fact that, the guy who played this lead, Coleman Domingo, is actually a gay person. And this was only the second openly gay man to be nominated for playing a gay character, which is pretty amazing. So this is taken from the New York Times. This is their lead up to the Oscars. And here is Coleman Domingo in his outfit for the red carpet for the Oscars. And I discovered that one of the rings that he's wearing is one of Bayard Rustin's rings. So that's a pretty cool thing. So I also discovered that in addition to all these things that Bayard Rustin was doing, he cut an album. And it wasn't popular music. It was actually Elizabethan songs and Negro spirituals. And I love this cover. It's very mid-century modern. And as you see here with harpsichord accompaniment with Margaret Davison. And here she is with a harpsichord. There's a whole bunch of blurb about this. I thought that was really, really fascinating that he actually not only was, someone who's a singer, but actually was singing more of this classic repertoire. Now, for myself, I see him following the footsteps of someone like William Warfield. And William Warfield, Rochester resident, graduated from Eastman. I was the president of the William Warfield Scholarship Fund for a couple of years. We gave it to young African-American singers who were performing classical music as well as Negro spirituals. And so this to me is really cool. Here's another album, 12 Spirituals on the Life of Christ.
Wow.
So following the church year. And starting with Emma, so which is pretty cool. So yeah, so just so you know, you can find him singing on YouTube. We won't do it one more time. But he's like sings a song by John Dowland, this British guy from like the 1600s, which is pretty cool. All right, so this is my friend Loudon, and I took these photographs of Loudon when he was a student at Eastman. And as you can see, he's not playing a guitar. What is he playing? A lute. They say that people sometimes have their business is their name. There are lots of dentists whose first name is Dennis. And in German, lute is Laute. And so his name is very similar to his instrument. So one day Loudon was hanging around and he got a call from Branford Marsalis. The Branford Marsalis. And when I say one day, I mean in the last year and a half or so. And you see that there's a soundtrack album to this movie. And we heard probably some of the music in that trailer. Not, sometimes trailer music is not in a movie, but I bet you that music is. And he said, Loudon, I want you to play the lute on this movie about Bayard Rustin. And Loudon said, why? And Branford said, because Bayard Rustin played the lute.
Wow.
Oh my God. So there's a scene in the movie where he's playing the lute a little bit, and it's just a very short scene. But on the soundtrack album, it's an entire song with Loudon playing the lute, which is super cool. Now, just like I've gone down this crazy rabbit hole with these two people, Loudon went down this crazy rabbit hole with Bayard Rustin and ended up writing the cover story for Lute Quarterly about Bayard Rustin. Rustin, singer, lutenist, angelic troublemaker. And this just came out spring, summer 2023, just right before the movie came out. And it's 4 pages, has this cover. I was like, what the heck? And then there's a photograph of him with Dr. King. How cool is that? How cool is that to have a connection with somebody?
Yeah.
So what are some other connections? Well, this connection is huge. The connection of this area, okay? So somewhere in here, well, here's Westchester. Westchester is where both Bayard Taylor and Bayard Rustin were born. Philadelphia was where Bayard Rustin was kind of had his headquarters of most of his life. Kennett Square over here near Longwood Gardens, which was a property owned by the DuPonts. Beautiful, fabulous gardens, fabulous house, fabulous organ. They have an organ competition there. They have an organ in their house. It's right there next to Kennett Square. Kennett Square is where Bayard Taylor lived for quite a few years, from the 1850s to the 70s, and where he built the Cedar Croft House. And of course, right next to Philadelphia, right across the river in New Jersey is Camden. And that's where Walt Whitman lived the rest of his life after helping the Civil War soldiers around DC. Oh yeah, all within just a tiny little bit here, okay? So the other thing that connects all these folks, of course, is the fact that they have this Quaker heritage, which to me is super fascinating. Walt Whitman's parents, Quakers. He grew up as a young man on Long Island. There's a Walt Whitman Mall on Long Island. You can go shopping in it. But he comes from Quaker stock. Bayard Taylor comes from Quaker stock, going all the way back to the time of William Penn. Bayard Rustin comes from Quaker stock. And in fact, this book came out in the 1950s, Speaking Truth to Power, a Quaker search for an alternative to violence. And of course, who else is from Quaker stock? Right here. The Public Universal Friend.
All comes together.
Who was pretty Quakery. Okay, grew up as a Quaker, called their society the Society of Universal Friends. Was pretty Quakery in their outlook, was Quaker adjacent. Okay, and I think that to me is super interesting that this person who is such an important part of this community historically is also connected to these people. Whitman, who had such an influence on Bayard Taylor, Bayard Rustin. Yeah, so this book right here is the only book that I could find that actually talks about both of these people. Both Bayard Taylor and Bayard Rustin are in A Queer History of the United States. Guess who else is in here? The Puff. In fact, a lot of people learned about the Public Universal Friend through this book, which is astonishing. Even people who I talk about the Puff on a podcast say, I read about the Puff in the Queer History of the United States. And if
They call her the Puff?
they back then they called the Puff, yes, the Puff. What I think is also cool is that, at the end of this, talks about act up, the people who've gone too far to assert their own independence and deeply have beliefs about social justice, such as Anne Hutchinson, Jemima Wilkinson, the Puff, Harriet Tubman, Walt Whitman, Victoria Woodhull, Eleanor Roosevelt, Harry Hay, Bayard Rustin, all in the same sentence, all right there. It's just like astonishing. But what led this whole thing, why we're here is because of this. I'm gonna pass this out. This is an article from March 9th. 3 months ago. Bayard Rustin's connection to queer history may have started with his very name. Rustin was the namesake of fellow Pennsylvanian Bayard Taylor, author of what some now deem America's first gay novel. Wow. And that's what led me down this rabbit hole. This article, I went, oh, look at that. And so, yeah, so this is talking about the movies, this is right before the Academy Awards. I mean, it was up, Cillian Murphy won for Oppenheimer. instead of Coleman. But Coleman was up for Best Actor, which is, pretty amazing. And if you look at, turn the page, Joseph and his friend, the story of Pennsylvania. And what's also really interesting, I mean, it just talks about all these things. You see the Centennial Ode, the National Ode is mentioned in here. There's some quotations from Joseph and his brother. But what I think is interesting is it says, even post Stonewall, there was a hesitation to say Joseph and his friend was a homosexual novel, but still the strongest candidate. And, which is amazing. It's just so funny that even those passages I read to you, you're like, oh, yeah. Hello, ding, ding, it's like, okay, so, yeah. And then it actually ends with the thing about Bismarck, about how Otto von Bismarck, Chancellor of Germany, read Joseph and his brother, which is so crazy. Like, what? Okay, this is weird. Yeah. So Bayard Rustin's full name is Bayard Taylor Rustin.
Oh.
So many knots are.
Yes. Yeah.
Association.
And that's pretty much it.
Wow.
But I wanted you to know about. Thank you. Thank you. No, I'm blushing. So, thank
Your
you, thank
mind
you.
must have been going 100 miles an hour when you were trying to figure out all the connections.
It totally was, and I was like, okay, what can I find out about Joseph and his brother that's not like an anthology where it's just quoting it, And so I found all these books about, homosexuality in literature in the 19th century, especially, before Stonewall, gay literature before Stonewall, and it all is mentioning this. And then starting to poke around and look at things that were from the late 19th century about him, like that quote about the novel, it's sort of a somewhat contemporary review of it, which was very damning, and now none of Bayard Taylor's works are excerpted in anything except gay anthologies. And it's seen as part of this chain of authorship that goes all the way back to, the Greeks, all the way up to, through Allen Ginsberg and, the writers of today. So, yeah, I think it's really interesting. Was Bayard Taylor gay? I don't know. It's really hard to tell. Even this article says, but, he sort of went beyond just the friendship, the romantic friendship, to actually going more in Walt Whitman territory. Whitman was not a genteel author. He was more like, this is it. This is, it's about sex, a lot of it is, not all of Whitman's stuff is about gay stuff, but enough of it is that you're like, okay. And to have these other people sort of see it and pick it out and be able to sort of connect the dots, I think it's pretty amazing. I mean, even Oscar Wilde came and visited Walt Whitman when he was on his tour.
So
Go figure.
what was the quality of life? Because I don't know, what was the quality of life in the mid 1800s for gay people?
Well,
You said it was illegal and.
well, it was certainly illegal in England, of course, but I think in America, you didn't really have like a suburb. You didn't have sort of a respectable suburb. You either had people that lived out in the country and nobody knew what they did at all, really, because they lived miles away from each other, or people that lived in the city where people didn't care, and where a place like Pfaff's was a place not only for bohemian folks to get together and drink and talk about writing, but to also have this sort of male interaction. Pfaff's was only a bar for men, and of course, a respectable woman wouldn't have gone in there. But these were places, even what's that super McSorley's in New York City, which has been around.
Same thing about the Wild West saloons.
Oh yeah, totally. The men dancing together, very much so. I mean, sailors. I mean, the whole thing with where men are together, and either people look the other way, or they were okay with it.
I've read that the serious social taboo around homosexuality in America didn't really develop until like the time of the Red Scare, when America was trying to set itself apart from what was seen as like the obliteration of gender roles that the Soviet Union was supposed to be
Sure.
undertaking. So
You even
that's
see-
when,
yeah,
and
you
then
even see that in
McCarthy
World War
jumps up and is
II.
like, hey, you're gay, you're gay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you look at the pre-code movies before the Hays Code, and there's so much homosexuality all the way throughout, sometimes as for humorous effect. But when you start to see this sort of weird cracking down on this art form that was a mass media thing in the 1930s, and then by the 1950s, there was definitely this sort of swing to the right. There was definitely this sort of oppression in a huge way. Yeah.
From what I've read, to answer your question, it seems as if it's kind of hard for me to express this, but I'll try. It was kind of so not on the radar of like the mainstream society.
You just need to think about it.
Like, yeah, they didn't spend a lot of time focusing on it, and they didn't see it as anything real in a way, which in a way gave people more freedom. So I think that's how a lot of things happened back then. Now we have this ultra focus with the trans issues and everything, and the far right is cracking down. Also, you guys all might know this, but one of the key figures to help America win the revolution was von Steuben.
Yep.
So George Washington definitely knew he was homosexual because he was very open about it.
He was.
And George Washington was like, no, we need this guy, and he's gonna train the Continental Army to be a.
It's very much like how the leaders of the movement were like, we need this guy for Bayard Rustin, you know, very much so. Yeah, Steuben County is actually named after him.
And it's so great that one of our more, shall we say, rural counties is named for a homosexual Revolutionary War hero.
Do they know that?
They might, some of them.
You know, Steuben Glass, you know,
Uh-huh.
his name is on so much stuff, you know, it's kind of crazy.
Cool.
You know, yeah, it's amazing, you know. I have some of my photo collection on display right now at the Genesee Country Village. And I'm actually gonna give a talk about my collection. And it's gonna be kind of based on my TED Talk about, you know, the so whole affectionate men question in photography. And the image that they posted, and then has also been posted on another site called Hot Victorians, which has over 1,000 likes now. But when the museum posted that picture, people were like, oh, this is great. Thanks for posting this picture, because this photograph also comes with a note inside. And it says, you know, forget me not, or till yonder sun shall set forever. And so it takes it beyond just men sitting next to each other closely and being photographed for 30 seconds by a stranger to have this singular image. There's this keepsake, okay? But there's this piece of paper in it that has extra photographic evidence of this relationship. Now, yes, maybe they are just having a romantic friendship, but it could be more. And this kind of shows it's a little bit more than just physical attraction and physical connection, okay? And it's been very interesting. You know, they say, don't read the comments, but on the post on the museum's site, you know, Instagram feed, there are people saying, don't try to push this politics down our throat. Don't try to twist history. And I'm thinking to myself, all right, you need to look at all these books that I just got out of. All of these, this whole pile, you need to look at this, because guess what? The only part that's around now is like right here, okay?
Yeah.
Everything else in this book is history. This entire book is before 1914. So, so this, there's this, we've always been here. Well, we've always been here. And sometimes it has been expressed in writing, in drama, in artwork, in letters, in photography, and yeah, it's interesting. I'm like keeping out of it. I'm just like letting the museum kind of deal with this. in their own way, because I don't speak for the museum. They're borrowing my stuff. And I'm happy that at the end of July, I'm gonna come in and give a lecture there. And it'll be, I'm sure some of it will be similar to this. I'm not gonna talk about Jenny Lind, which is okay. But I will talk about this whole idea of what's going on here. Why are they holding hands? Why, who got this photograph? Who took it? Who posed them this way? Was it their idea? Was it the photographer? Why are they sitting on each other's lap in a way that's not just fooling around?
Yeah.
You know? You know, I mean,
It's fascinating.
No,
It is
it's
fascinating.
obvious, but it's, as you say, people are so scared though, that they want to go into denial and to the point of feeling a need to write a comment as an
Yep.
attack.
yeah,
Instead of just going, oh, isn't that interesting? They were like, no, we have to fight this.
Yeah.
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 And they do, they feel like they have to fight it. They feel like the museum is going woke, you know? Whereas what it's doing is it's representing what really was, it's real history, you know?
Hiding it.
And, you know, this of course has been happening at museums where people are acknowledging slavery at a plantation or a house museum. Where people, you know, where African-American people are actually working at those museums. And people are like, oh, you know, I didn't come here to, you know, to learn this. Well, this is what really happened, you know, guess what? So when I saw this on NBC News, I was like, this is a big deal. This is a big deal. And the fact that, you know, an article from 2024 from one of the 3 networks in America that mentions Fitz Green Halleck. I'm like, okay, this is where we are. This is great, you know? It's just so cool to see this on there and to connect it to this movie and to show to start to show these connections, you know? With the past, with someone from some of our past. You know, some of us were around in 1987. Some of us, I wasn't around in 1963, but I was around in 1965. You know, I remember all the marches against the Vietnam War. I remember the marches for women's equality. I don't think my parents let me see the marches for gay equality so much, you know? But by the time Anita Bryant showed up, I knew what a gay person was, you know?
Standard.
Yeah, so,
Well, we're in for a big roller coaster ride and
yeah,
we don't know what's going to happen, but I was just reading in the news in the past 24 hours, an article about a progressive and heavily LGBT bookstore in Indiana, which is putting out an emergency call that it's, you know, just about to die because libraries in Indiana have stopped asking for its books, and that was one of its revenue streams. And that's because they just passed a law, like it's official, not to have anything quote unquote queer in literature for schools.
yep,
And that if you do, as a teacher, it's a felony.
yep. Yep,
So
yep.
the
There-
schools are
yep.
all canceling, you know,
Yep.
orders, and they are removing any books that have to do with queer. This is in a state in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
today.
Oh, yeah. I mean, of course, Florida is like the epicenter of a lot of this. You know, we've been really lucky in New York State to have very supportive governments. But, you know,
They could do a national law.
When I was here a couple months ago, talking about the LGBT library that I also take care of. We've had 3 separate extremist events, 3 extremist events connected to LGBTQ books in Monroe County, where Rochester is. Okay, one of them was in Pittsford, where they wanted to have a drag queen story hour at the public library. And the Proud Boys showed up.
Great.
And they ended up moving it to the community center. And the community center of the town, they wanted to charge something like $5,000 for security. And the community said, if you're gonna do that, you have to charge everybody $5,000 for security. You can't do that. Plus, they also got a note from the Human Rights Campaign and the ACLU telling them that they couldn't do that. So they backed down, but the Proud Boys did show up to the community center reading. And a whole bunch of other people showed up too, with umbrellas to kind of shield the kids and to shield everybody. So that was a pretty extremist event in a pretty liberal county. I mean, right now, Monroe County has a Democratic legislature and a Democratic county executive, and the city has a Democratic city council and a Democratic mayor, and we're a Democratic state with all this others. So, you know, we're like living in like the best place that we could be living in terms of all these things, and still this is happening. The second extremist event was at Hilton at Central School, so it's on the west side of the county. Someone called in a bomb threat. And then they called in a bomb threat later telling that it was about a book in the school library called This Book is Gay. And hundreds of people were sent home and terrorized because of this. And the third thing that happened is I sort of found out about it, you know, kind of through the grapevine, because this young lady I know posted about it on her Facebook profile that the Moms for Liberty were trying to remove a book from a public library, the Riga Library, which is where Churchville is. That's the village in the town of Riga. And they ended up having to call a meeting to talk about it. And none of the Moms for Liberties showed up, but other people showed up to support the book, which is great. But then the Moms for Liberty were trying to defund the entire library.
Yeah.
Which I don't think would have worked because it's part of the Monroe County Library System and gets funding from New York State and the county as well as the town. So, you know, this is all happening right here. It's not just somewhere else. You know, and
I
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
add something, you may know about this, but Aeschylus, the Greek dramatist, had a play that was very much about the romantic and sexual love between Achilles and Patroclus. That is part of the, is it the Iliad or?
yeah, the Trojan War. Yeah.
But so many times, you know, over centuries, people are like, oh, it was just a friendship. And he went to war, you know, he got that extreme about it just because he was his good friend. But any gay man, even when you're a kid, you know, you're reading it and you're like, oh, I recognize
You
that.
totally do.
And Aeschylus had even written about it.
Yeah.
But that was probably the reason it doesn't exist anymore. It's a lost play. Is because, you know, Savonarola burning all the
Oh,
books
yes.
in
Yep, yep, yep.
Florence.
Yep.
That was probably one of the manuscripts that was,
Yeah, lost in the
Lost
bonfire
forever.
of the vanities.
and then we had monks and religious institutions responsible for translating and bringing forth things from the past that were homosexual and, you know,
Sure.
Lord knows how they handled that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, Paloma and I can talk all about John Boswell and his wonderful books that kind of strip away a lot of this crust of history, especially religious history, and go back into early medieval times and late Roman antiquity era, and how Sergius and Bacchus and, you know, all these folks.
But isn't it amazing how scared people get,
Oh, yeah, totally.
right?
So.
I mean, what
yeah.
are they scared of?
Yep,
Could you answer, can anyone
What
here
they
answer
don't
that?
know.
they're scared of what they don't know. They're scared,
They think that it,
they're
Calls
always,
their own
it's because
gender
there always has to be an other. There always has to be something that you're against. There always has to be something that's a foil that we can sort of
I'm better than.
pull you along, you know? And it's been racism, it's been sexism, it's been misogyny, it's been all these things for centuries, and it's still not eradicated. It's better, but it's still not eradicated in all these different ways. And, you know, yeah, I'm worried about what's gonna happen. I'm happy that the Lilac Library is its own thing. It's not connected to any kind of governmental institution who is responsible for its content or its financing. But at the same time, I also am cognizant of, we have the two rarest books we have in our collection are a 2-volume set about sexuality by Magnus Hirschfeld, who is a German scientist and doctor and sex researcher. He was the Kinsey of his day, the Masters and Johnson of his day. And his day was pretty long, from the start of the 20th century right until the Nazis took over in 1933, and they burned his entire library and destroyed it, you know? And, you know, so far, the Proud Boys have not found the Lilac Library, this physical location. But I've been, you know, trying to balance, as librarians and archivists always do, you balance preservation with access, you know? And you try to preserve stuff, but you also try to make it accessible to folks. And, you know, I don't want it to be a library where no one can enter because we're afraid that what they might do in there. I did suggest that we don't get a book drop though, because people can put things in book drops that
Oh,
are
yeah.
pretty unsavory.
Yeah.
You know, so, you know, and I also realized that I could be a target, you know? I have this friend who posted about how a school board flipped in, I think it was in Pennsylvania. And it was a local school board that had been run by, you know, Moms for Liberty types, and then the community elected a pretty progressive person. And she got sworn in on a pile of not a Bible, but on a pile of banned books, including This Book is Gay. And I thought that was amazing. And so this Facebook friend of mine shared this story from some news site and like from some news feed. And I commented, "This is great." And then what you saw is that the trolls were actually watching who was sharing it. And they were not her friends, but they were people because it was a public post. And they were calling me a pedophile.
Yeah.
Because I liked and said, "This is great" to her post, which was about this story. And so they were following that entire story from this major news site like ABC or AP News. And they were watching to see who was sharing it, and then they were trolling about it and calling everyone that was on there, someone that was, you know, not worthy of life. You know, it was that bad. And I thought, oh, this is what it's like, you know, to be afraid to go home, you know? And you know, I wonder about Bayard Rustin, who was so, you know, we see in these things that he was sort of behind the scenes, yes. But there were times where he did get up in front of the microphone, where he was being interviewed by someone with a TV camera or a movie camera, where people knew who he was. His name was in Jet. His name was in the regular newspaper. You know, he was not Martin Luther King Jr., but he was someone who was a public figure. And, you know, how his life was, how he wasn't targeted, how he was not, you know, under assassination threat, you know, his life because of the fact that.
Because they didn't think he was important enough.
Maybe, yeah, but the fact that he was gay would have cranked it up just another notch, you know? I think for, you know.
I want to say one more thing. I'm a fiction writer and I'm writing a novel series that I intend to be one of the biggest and best male love stories ever. That's my goal.
Okay.
And when I read articles about how they are, you know, banning all these books just based on theme, I mean, I'm way too deep into writing what I'm writing now for it to really affect that.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going forward no matter what. I won't be ready to market anything for, you know, at least a year or two as far as finding an agent for it and all that. But I, you know, kind of idly, one part of my brain is like, gee, is my timing just terrible? So, you know, it'll just be totally closed out.
Sure.
But on the other hand, when you ban something, as Stephen King has pointed out, sometimes it makes people go after those things even more.
Oh, that's the Barbara Streisand effect.
Yeah.
You know, where she says, you know, don't take pictures of my house. It makes people do that.
Yeah.
You know, and we saw that in Australia where there's a very wealthy woman who has an unflattering portrait in an art gallery right now. And she's trying to make them take it down. And of course, now it's on all these news stories and it had the
So
exact
everyone's
opposite
seeing it.
reaction. You know, I mean, what I love about the title of this book is that it's called, you know, Pages Passed from Hand to Hand. So these were things that were shared privately. So they may have been printed, but they were printed in small runs, maybe 300 copies, you know, and they were passed to other people, shared with other people, in a kind of almost kind of private way, you know, the hidden tradition of homosexual literature. So it's hidden because, you know, most straight folks don't know about this. Even most gay folks don't know about this history. But these two editors, Mark Mitchell and David Levitt, were able to kind of resurrect it and reprint these things, which is amazing. And, you know, people, you know, yes, there's Herman Melville. And there's Charles Warren Stoddard, who was one of the guys I just showed you. But
Herman Melville was gay.
Yeah, pretty much. He had a very strong romantic connection with Nathaniel Hawthorne. And so, in fact, 2 years ago at the Melville House, which is in the Berkshires, which is where he wrote Moby Dick. You'd think he was writing it on the shore of the ocean, but he wrote it up in the Berkshires, and his house has a name, just like Cedarcroft.
Yeah.
It's called Arrowhead. And it's a Greek revival house. And just this last year, or 2 years ago, I had a friend who went up to Arrowhead. He said, my husband and I are going up because they're putting on this play. And what it is, it's a play that all the lines are from the letters that Herman Melville wrote to Nathaniel Hawthorne and back. And he has a little video clip somewhere that shows the end of the play where they're totally in love. And it's this really cool thing where they were kind of moving around. It was an outdoor play, and there was an older guy who was playing Hawthorne, and the younger guy was playing Melville. And it was really, really cool to see, okay, not only that they were doing this, they were sort of taking this body of primary source material and turning it into something artistic, but that it was being allowed at the very home of Herman Melville and being sanctioned by the organization that cares for his home. Now, I don't know if that's a private thing or if it's like the state of Massachusetts or the National Park Service or whatever, but I thought that was really fascinating that this homoerotic, homosocial behavior, I mean, I kind of describe that a lot in the photographs that I collect, that it's homosocial behavior. Is it homoerotic behavior? I can't tell. Is it homosexual behavior? But it's homosocial. It's unique and different than just regular hanging out. And the letters that they sent to each other were kind of the same way. They were very, very passionate. And this idea of the romantic friendship, I showed you that slide. It was both men and women, especially in the 1830s and 40s. If you look at Joshua Speed and Abraham Lincoln, not just sharing a bed together, but writing romantic letters to each other. And a lot of times what happens is that the cycle, the connection gets broken when someone gets married, either because they really are in love or because of the way society, family pressure, whatever, expectations. And that usually seems to be the thing that severs it. And spoiler alert, it does sever it with Joseph and his friend. Maybe that's why it's just his friend. No, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, there's a really funny gay novel out there today called They All Die in the End, because there were so many books written for gay folks and about gay folks, especially in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, pulp fiction, that were usually not great literature. But the characters, someone dies or there's super heartbreak, and because that was sort of like, that was the trope. That was the homosexual could never be happy. They could experience happiness, but they could never have lasting happiness because, I know. And so
I'm just laughing because heterosexuals, half of the marriage is.
Oh, sure, of course. I'm gonna be the first to say that it's not in any way
Accurate. Yeah.
accurate.
But it was a trend.
There is this sort of trope and this trend of these novels. And, we have a pretty large collection of pulp fiction at the library. And, they're always, the covers are very lurid, even if the contents might not be as so much. But the covers are like about secret worlds, passions, and there are a lot of times we're set in the city, you go down this alley or go to this neighborhood and things happen, it's like, it's in many ways, it's like the demi-monde of France in the 19th century with the courtesans. And you see the courtesans appearing in movies like Gigi. You see the courtesan appearing in operas like La Traviata, where here's a person who is, their job is to have sex, really. They're like what we would consider a sex worker, but they can't really love someone because that would it's antithetical to their job of providing pleasure, of living a pleasurable life. Violetta is singing, always free to live my life of pleasure. And when Alfredo pops up, this poor poet, he's like a terrible match because he has no money, but he loves her. And so she has to sort of fight inside of herself between choosing love and choosing this life of sex, this sort of role that she's prescribed in. And the demi-monde in France, especially in Paris, was this sort of whole underground of people that were sex workers, but they were living this sort of lavish lifestyle, And of course, in that opera, the kicker is that she also has consumption. So she has TB, and so she passes away. It's really, a lot of people see the movie Moulin Rouge and they see La Boheme because the character dies from consumption in that, but it's really a retelling of La Traviata because that Satine character played by Nicole Kidman is a courtesan. And you asked about well, what was it like back in the 1850s? Well, in New York City, they had a place like Pfaff's where it was like this sort of underground. I mean, it literally was underground. It was a rathskeller, so it was like below ground. It had a curved roof, brick roof, and it was there all through the Civil War. So there were all sorts of people coming through, soldiers, sailors, immigrants, whatever. And I think a place like that had these dark corners,
I think they were fooling around.
I think they were fooling around. There's actually,
Gerry, I'd like to personally say that I really enjoy your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And I would wish that any high school kid could be allowed to have an experience where they can get excited about what they read and about the history in it and about what's going on. And it reminds me of how much I really did not like English in early high school until I got a teacher who taught sort of this way.
Yeah.
And what I remember is he got fired 3 times during the last couple of years of my high school. Of course, he got hired back each time because he was such a good teacher.
Oh my gosh.
Loved him.
He sounds like, Robin Williams type from Dead Poets Society,
So are you scared the way like authors are scared now about your academic life?
No, because I work at a pretty progressive place at the University of Rochester. We have a queer studies program, and I actually work in the music school. And so,
But what if the president of the university changes to a Trump-like figure?
I don't know. Yeah, we'll see. I mean, it could happen. It could,
Guaranteed.
Nothing is guaranteed, I think one thing that is, it's like, is it better that it's a private university as opposed to a state-run thing? Because we've seen what has happened in a place like Florida where a whole entire college was dismantled as a new board was put in and people were fired or people left of their own volition. I think having it be a private institution actually is probably helpful.
Yeah, you might even thrive because it would be the only place for people to go if they want to tap into that.
Yeah, we'll see. This topic, especially these two people and their connections and all these connections that I learned about in creating this, and using this article as a jumping point off. But when I teach at the Eastman School, I teach a really boring class, or a class that could be really boring. It's about library research, and it's about how to use encyclopedias and dictionaries and thematic catalogs and what's the difference between an annotation and an abstract? What's the difference between a biobibliography and a guide to research? I mean, this is like super dry stuff, and I try to make it as interesting as possible because it's really helpful for people in their research if it's conveyed in a way that will make them interested. And it's been really satisfying to me to see some students really use the library and its resources for their performance capabilities. I have a student who graduated probably 12 years ago, who's a trombonist. He took my class and he comes in the library once a month and sits down and goes through all the old music. And when I say old, he's looking at stuff from the 15th, 16th, 17th century. Stuff that's only printed in certain collections, monuments, collected works, and arranging them for his ensemble. And his ensemble is great because it performs music of Jewish composers from the Renaissance, medieval Renaissance, and Baroque. And so they've actually performed quite a bit in the Syracuse and Central New York area. They're called In Cantare, if you ever get to hear them. But he's doing that research, and he's told me that the only way that he knows how to do this is because of what I taught him. You know, and I think, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so cool, I'm hoping that, what I do is meaningful to somebody, and I hope that for you all, if you want to explore any of these folks, if you want to explore about Bayard Taylor, Google Books has, all of Bayard Taylor's stuff is in the public domain, all of it, every single thing he wrote, and then lots of stuff about him is in the public domain. You can find it on Google Books. Just click, search them and, you'll find all this stuff. And some of it's gonna be a little in the weeds, some of it's gonna be, around these other terrible poets, if you will, these no-name folks. But, the same with Bayard Rustin, you can, because he lived in the and he was active in the latter half of the 20th century, there is so much video material of him online. Like I said, you can watch Brother Outsider online. You can watch, of course, Rustin on Netflix, but there's lots of video clips, and then all of that, his performances of singing, they're all on YouTube. It's almost like there's this vast library just of this other person that's available in a different way, in a way that's more AV, if you will. Whereas with Bayard Taylor, you can read everything that he wrote, and
That first
yeah.
quote you did from Bayard Taylor's novel about the Joseph and his friend or whatever it's called. I found that first quote more powerful than even the second one. Is that in that anthology by David Levitt?
I'm not sure if it is. I'm not sure what parts they stuck in there.
Where did you get it?
Oh, I actually got it from the book called The Homosexual Poetry.
Do you have something I can take with me of it?
I believe I do. I believe I have this title page, which I always photocopy because I'm a librarian.
A better librarian than I.
I always photocopy the title page.
And certainly, I think the holy grail would be to find an old grainy video of Bayard Rustin playing on his lute, Bayard Taylor's Jenny Lind.
Oh, wouldn't that be great? Oh, I'm sure, because he had that connection that he knew about this.
You would hope so.
Everybody knew about the greeting to America. So before y'all go, I want to take a picture of. One of those is gonna be great.
Well, thank you again.
Oh,
Really wonderful. We could do that. I also, just before we do that, I wanted to say, send me and or Columba and or whoever the information about your talk at the museum,
sure.
So we have it on our calendar. Maybe.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah.
Oh,
sure. Thank you.
But yes, by way of maybe running the credits for this gathering we're doing a little bit backwards here with introductions though, but I am Alex. I am the